The 2-year-old baby persistently points at his father's coffin, his small finger tracing the edges with eerie precision. His mother, Sarah, is filled with dread, unable to comprehend the unsettling behavior. What begins as innocent curiosity soon turns into something far more sinister. In the dead of night, the child speaks, his voice not his own, revealing cryptic messages only Sarah can decipher. The curse that has haunted her bloodline for generations is not over. In fact, it has just begun, and her son may be the key to unlocking an unimaginable horror. The terrifying truth is about to unfold. It was an ordinary morning in the Johnson household. The sun was just starting to peek through the curtains, casting a warm, golden glow across the living room. Sarah, a young mother, hummed softly as she prepared breakfast in the kitchen. Her husband, Tom, was sitting at the dining table, reading the newspaper. Their 2-year-old son, Ethan, was in the corner of the room, playing with his toys, his innocent laughter filling the air. Everything seemed as normal as it had ever been. But then, without warning, something strange happened. Ethan, who had been happily playing with his building blocks just moments before, suddenly froze. He slowly turned his head and stared at the far corner of the room. Sarah, lost in her thoughts, didn't notice at first. It wasn't until Ethan began to raise his tiny finger and point at something in that corner that she looked up. At first, Sarah thought it was just a random gesture. But as she followed his gaze, her heart skipped a beat. There, in the corner of the room, stood Tom's coffin, an antique piece of furniture that had been passed down through generations. It had been placed there months ago as a reminder of their family's past, but it was also a symbol of grief after Tom's sudden passing. Sarah had tried to push the memory of that day away, but seeing it now, with Ethan pointing at it so intently, sent a shiver down her spine. "Ethan, sweetheart, what are you looking at?" Sarah asked softly, walking toward her son, her voice laced with concern. But Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he just kept pointing, his eyes wide with a strange, unblinking focus. The room felt colder all of a sudden, and Sarah's heartbeat quickened. It was as if the little boy was trying to communicate something beyond his ability to express. She glanced at Tom's coffin once more, feeling a strange heaviness settle in her chest. Sarah tried to shake off the unsettling feeling as she scooped Ethan up into her arms, pulling him away from the coffin. His finger dropped, but his gaze remained locked on the dark corner of the room, his small face filled with a strange intensity. He didn't speak, as if lost in some silent communication with the object that had once been a reminder of family history. "Come on, sweetie," Sarah whispered, cradling him close. "Let's go play somewhere else." She turned to look at Tom, hoping to share her growing discomfort with him. But to her surprise, Tom was staring at the coffin too, a frown knitting his brow. "What's going on?" Sarah asked. "Why is he acting like that?" Tom shook his head, clearly bewildered. "I don't know. It's like he's connected to it somehow." Despite his usual rational nature, Tom's voice cracked as he spoke. The entire situation felt too bizarre to be simply brushed off. Ethan, still in his mother's arms, was no longer pointing, but now mumbling softly. His words were jumbled and unclear, just a string of incoherent sounds that made no sense. Sarah's pulse quickened. She had heard stories of children behaving oddly around things like this, stories of the supernatural. But she had never believed them, until now. The days that followed were filled with strange occurrences. At night, Ethan would wake up crying, pointing at the coffin, even though no one was around. He would whisper something under his breath, though Sarah couldn't make out the words. Each time she approached him, he would stop and look at her, almost as if he was aware that he was doing something unnatural. Sarah spoke to Tom about it constantly. They even consulted a pediatrician, who assured them that a 2-year-old's behavior could sometimes be erratic and inexplicable. But Sarah wasn't so sure. The way Ethan seemed to be drawn to the coffin, almost like he was in a trance, was unsettling. Something deeper, something darker seemed to be at play. One afternoon, Sarah sat down beside Ethan as he played in the living room. She tried to distract him with his favorite toys, but his little fingers slowly turned toward the corner. He started pointing again. Not at the toys or the window, but at the coffin. Sarah's eyes widened as she followed his gaze. A chill ran down her spine. This time, she felt it too. An eerie stillness in the room, a heavy silence that made her heart race. It wasn't just the pointing anymore. Over the next few days, Ethan's behavior grew even more perplexing. He started saying strange things in his babyish way, barely comprehensible to anyone but Sarah. It was almost as though he was speaking to someone or something that wasn't there. One evening, while Sarah was washing dishes, she overheard Ethan talking softly to himself. His voice was muffled, but she could distinctly make out the words, though they didn't make sense. "Come closer, please." "Daddy," Ethan mumbled. Sarah froze, her hands trembling as she held onto the dish sponge. Her blood ran cold. Ethan hadn't called his father Daddy since Tom passed away. Tom's sudden death had been unexpected. He had been healthy, full of life, and then one day, it was all gone. Ethan was barely old enough to understand the concept of death, but now it seemed as if he was calling out to Tom, or perhaps something else pretending to be him. "Ethan?" Sarah called, her voice shaking. The little boy stopped. He slowly turned to face her, his big eyes filled with something that Sarah couldn't name. There was no sign of the usual playfulness he'd had just weeks before. In his stare, there was a weight, a heaviness that made Sarah's stomach twist. He simply smiled, a quiet, almost eerie smile. That night, Sarah lay awake in bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling. Ethan was sleeping soundly in his crib, or so she thought, but just as she was about to drift off, she heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Mama, help me." The voice sounded like Ethan's, but there was a deep, guttural undertone that made her skin crawl. Sarah sat up in bed, her heart racing. She glanced over at Tom's empty side of the bed. "Tom, is that you?" she whispered, but her voice came out shaky and uncertain. There was no answer, but the whisper came again. This time, it was clearer. "Mama, help me. He's coming. For me." Terror gripped Sarah's chest. Was it a dream? Or was something truly happening in their home? Something supernatural and far beyond her comprehension? The following day, Sarah decided she couldn't ignore what was happening any longer. She reached out to a local paranormal investigator, a woman named Laura, who had a reputation for solving strange occurrences. Laura agreed to visit the house and examine the situation. When she arrived, she immediately sensed the tension in the air. The house felt heavy, almost suffocating, and she wasted no time in setting up her equipment. "I've dealt with cases like this before," Laura said, her voice low. "But something about this is different. There's an energy here, something old. I can feel it." As the investigator worked, Sarah couldn't help but notice how Ethan seemed to react to Laura's presence. The baby became even more fixated on the coffin. His fingers twitched as he pointed toward it once again. "Mama, he's here," Ethan said in a low, raspy voice. Sarah's heart pounded as Laura turned toward the coffin. "There's definitely something attached to this place," Laura murmured, her eyes wide with realization. After a lengthy investigation, Laura uncovered an unsettling truth. The coffin had once belonged to an ancestor of Tom's, someone who had died under mysterious circumstances. Legend had it that the man's death was tied to a curse, a family secret that no one dared to speak of. As Sarah and Laura dug deeper, they found evidence that the spirit of Tom's ancestor had never truly left the family. It had attached itself to the coffin, waiting for the right moment to re-enter the family's life. But why was it focusing on Ethan now? Why had he become its target? Laura explained that Ethan, as a child, was particularly sensitive to these energies. Spirits often targeted the innocent, especially those who hadn't yet learned to block out such influences. And now, It seemed that the spirit was trying to communicate through Ethan, manipulating him to draw closer to the coffin. This spirit, it wants to take something. Something precious, Laura said, grimly. The more Laura learned about the coffin's history, the more terrifying the situation became. That night, after the investigator left, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Ethan was quiet, almost too quiet. The house felt suffocating, heavy with a presence she couldn't explain. She checked on Ethan, only to find him sitting up in his crib, staring blankly at the corner of the room, where the coffin stood. As the clock struck midnight, a chilling wind blew through the house, rattling the windows. Sarah's heart raced as she saw Ethan's tiny finger pointing once again, this time towards the empty space beside the coffin. "Who's there, Ethan?" Sarah whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. But Ethan didn't answer. He just kept staring, his eyes wide, his small face locked in an expression of terror. The room grew colder. A shadow flickered across the wall, then disappeared as quickly as it had come. Then, for the first time, Ethan spoke clearly. "He's coming. He wants me." Sarah couldn't understand it. Was Ethan simply imagining things, or was something truly haunting their home? She thought back to the stories Laura had told her. Tales of cursed objects and restless spirits that clung to the living. The more she considered the possibility, the more she feared for her son's safety. That night, she placed a protective charm under Ethan's pillow, hoping it would keep the spirit away. But as the hours passed, she could feel the air in the house grow denser. Something was coming, and it wasn't going to stop until it had what it wanted. At one point, Sarah found herself standing by the coffin, unable to turn away. It felt as if the house was calling to her. Her thoughts became clouded, and a strange force began to pull her toward it. It was as if the spirit of the ancestor was reaching out, trying to manipulate her, just as it had done to Ethan. But Sarah fought it. She grabbed the charm from under her pillow, clutched it tightly in her hand, and whispered a prayer for protection. The pull eased. The room felt lighter, as if the weight of the presence had lifted, if only for a moment. Sarah couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just her imagination. The spirit, or whatever it was growing stronger. It was now clear that it wasn't just after Ethan. It was after something much more sinister. She sat down with Laura the next morning, telling her everything that had transpired. Laura listened intently, nodding gravely as Sarah spoke. "There's something you're missing," Laura said softly. "The spirit doesn't just want Ethan. It wants the bloodline, the family. It wants to complete what was started years ago." The revelation shook Sarah to her core. It wasn't just a random haunting. The curse tied to the coffin was something deeper, something ancient. It had been waiting for the right moment, the right generation, to come full circle. "This isn't just about Ethan," Laura continued. "It's about your entire family line. This spirit is connected to the Johnson bloodline, and it's using Ethan to get closer to its ultimate goal." As the days passed, Ethan became more withdrawn, his once playful spirit replaced by an unsettling quietness. Sarah could see it in his eyes. He was afraid, not of the world, but of the entity that was slowly taking control of him. She knew she had to act fast before it was too late. One evening, as Sarah and Laura performed a ritual to break the spirit's hold on Ethan, the air in the room grew thick with tension. Shadows danced along the walls, and the temperature dropped. Ethan's small body trembled as his eyes rolled back in his head. Then, in a voice not his own, Ethan spoke. "You cannot stop it. It is my time. The bloodline must be reclaimed." A deep, guttural laugh echoed through the room, sending chills down Sarah's spine. The entity was stronger than they had realized, and it was taking over Ethan more completely with every passing moment. Realizing that the spirit's power was growing, Sarah and Laura decided they needed to find a way to sever the connection between Ethan and the coffin for good. Laura suggested an ancient ritual, a dangerous one, that could rid them of the spirit, but would come with a heavy price. The ritual required the destruction of the coffin. It was the anchor the spirit used to manipulate time and space, and if it was destroyed, the curse would finally be broken. But Sarah knew it wouldn't be that simple. The coffin had been in the family for generations, and the spirit's power was deeply tied to it. Destroying the coffin might come with irreversible consequences. Still, there was no choice. Ethan's safety was the priority. The night of the ritual arrived. Sarah, Laura, and a small group of trusted friends gathered in the living room, where the coffin stood. Ethan was absent, kept safely in a room upstairs. With trembling hands, Sarah and Laura began the incantation, their voices low and steady. The coffin began to shake, rattling as if something inside was fighting to escape. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, and the temperature plummeted. Then, with one final word, the coffin cracked open, releasing a burst of energy that sent everyone stumbling backward. The air hummed with the power of the spirit as it let out a furious, deafening scream. In that moment, Sarah knew what she had to do. She rushed toward the coffin and, with all her strength, brought the charm she had kept so close to her chest down onto the wood. The coffin exploded in a blinding flash of light. The room fell silent. The air grew still, and the shadows slowly receded. The spirit was gone. Ethan was safe. But Sarah knew that the battle wasn't truly over. The curse had been broken, but the memories would remain. She would always wonder if there were other spirits out there, waiting, watching, and she would never forget the price they had paid. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, the weight of what had just transpired sinking in. Ethan was now in bed, peacefully sleeping after the nightmarish ordeal. The house felt quieter, calmer, but it was as if the air itself had changed. The oppressive weight of the spirit's presence was gone, but in its place, an unsettling calm had settled over the house. But even in the silence, Sarah felt a lingering unease. She knew something wasn't right. The destruction of the coffin had severed the curse, yes, but there was a part of her that wondered if the spirit was truly gone. Had they banished it for good, or was it simply lying in wait for the right moment to return? A few days after the ritual, Sarah received a letter. It was a strange, thick envelope with no return address. Her hands shook as she opened it, revealing a single piece of paper with the words, "You cannot escape your bloodline." The message was cryptic and unsettling. But what truly sent a chill down Sarah's spine was the faint scent of old wood that lingered on the paper, as if the coffin itself had left its mark on the letter. The letter left her with more questions than answers. Who had sent it? How did they know what had happened? And, most terrifying of all, what did the message mean? Had the spirit found a way to communicate from beyond the grave? As Sarah struggled to make sense of the letter, strange things began to happen again. Ethan, who had seemed like his old self for a time, began to act out in odd ways. He would stand in front of the mirror and stare at himself, whispering words that sounded like another language. His eyes would occasionally flicker with that same strange intensity Sarah had seen when the spirit had first taken hold of him. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't just the coffin that seemed to be calling to him. It was something else, something deeper, more insidious. Determined to uncover more, Sarah dug into her family's history. She scoured old journals, records, and letters that had been passed down from generation to generation. Finally, she stumbled upon an old, forgotten document that detailed the origins of the curse. The spirit that had haunted their family wasn't just some random ghost. It was a vengeful ancestor who had committed unspeakable acts in life, and his spirit had been bound to the coffin as a way to contain his dark energy. But the binding had failed, and now every generation of the family would be cursed to suffer at his hands. Sarah now realized that the coffin wasn't just a relic, it was a prison, and her family had been the wardens. The curse had been passed down through the bloodline, and it wasn't over yet. Ethan's behavior worsened as the days passed. He began having violent outbursts, lashing out at Sarah and others. His words became more fragmented, and sometimes it seemed as if he wasn't even speaking his own thoughts. One night, After another terrifying incident where Ethan screamed in the middle of the night, Sarah called Laura for help once more. The paranormal investigator returned, bringing with her a sense of urgency. "The spirit is no longer tied to the coffin," Laura explained, her face grim. "It's using Ethan as a vessel, but it's growing stronger. It's trying to take control completely." Sarah knew the situation was dire. The spirit wasn't just tormenting Ethan. It was trying to possess him entirely. If that happened, there might be no saving him. Sarah knew what she had to do, but she was terrified. If the spirit could possess Ethan, there might be no way to save him. The only chance they had was to destroy the coffin's remnants completely. The last piece of it had been hidden away by her ancestors, but finding it would require her to confront everything she feared. Sarah stood in front of the small hidden room in the attic, where the final remnants of the coffin had been stored. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the sealed box. Was this the answer? Would destroying the last of the coffin finally put an end to the curse? With a deep breath, she opened the box. Inside the box, Sarah found something that chilled her to the core, a small wooden shard, darkened with age. It was a part of the coffin, but not just any part. This was the final piece that had kept the spirit anchored to their bloodline. It had been hidden away for years, a last-ditch effort to keep the curse at bay. As soon as Sarah touched the shard, a wave of dark energy washed over her. The room seemed to pulse with an unnatural force, and for a moment, she felt as if she were losing control. The spirit tried to take hold of her, just as it had tried to take Ethan. But she fought back, clutching the shard with all her strength. In the dead of night, Sarah returned to the living room, the shard in her hand. She knew that if she destroyed it, the curse would finally be broken. But as she approached the fireplace, she felt a presence behind her. Ethan stood in the doorway, his eyes blank, his body trembling. For a moment, she couldn't tell if it was really him or if the spirit had fully taken control. "Mama, don't," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling with fear. Sarah's heart broke as she gazed at her son, but she knew what had to be done. She raised the shard above the fire, her hands shaking, and with a single motion, she dropped it into the flames. As Sarah watched the shard burn in the fire, a sense of finality seemed to settle over her. The room was eerily still, as if time had stopped. The dark energy that had suffocated their home for weeks dissipated, leaving only the faint smell of burning wood. For a moment, she thought it was over. But then, a soft, raspy voice filled the air. "You cannot destroy what is already part of you." Sarah turned to find Ethan standing in the doorway, his eyes wide and hollow. His small body seemed almost too still, too rigid, as if someone else were controlling him. Her heart raced. "You've destroyed the last piece," the voice continued, "but you've forgotten that I am inside you. I am your bloodline, your family. You cannot escape me." Sarah's mind raced. Had she made a mistake? Was this really the end of the curse? Or had she made it worse? Ethan stepped forward, his movements stiff and unnatural. His voice grew darker with every word. "Join me, Sarah. You cannot fight what you are. We are bound together." The shadow of the spirit's power loomed over her, and she knew what it meant. The curse wasn't merely about the coffin or the spirit itself. It was about the bloodline, about the darkness that had been passed down through generations. Fear gripped her heart, but Sarah wouldn't give in. She couldn't let her son become the vessel for this evil. She had to find a way to save him, once and for all. She turned to Laura, who had been standing in the doorway, watching in horror. "I know what I must do," Sarah said, her voice firm. "The bloodline has to end. I can't let this continue." Laura nodded solemnly. "Then we finish what your ancestors started." Sarah and Laura began to prepare for what they knew would be the final confrontation with the spirit. They couldn't rely on the same rituals that had worked before. This time, it was more than just destroying objects. It was about severing the connection that bound the spirit to the family line. They spent days researching, learning ancient texts, and gathering the ingredients for a ritual that had been used centuries ago to sever a bloodline's curse. But even as they prepared, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The spirit had been inside Ethan for so long, and the longer it stayed, the more powerful it became. Ethan's behavior grew more erratic, more violent. At times, Sarah would find him standing alone in the dark corners of the house, whispering things she couldn't understand. And whenever she tried to approach him, it felt as though an invisible force was pushing her away. The night of the ritual arrived. Sarah stood before the ancient altar in the attic. The space now transformed into a circle of symbols, drawn with salt and ash. Laura stood beside her, silently preparing the final elements. Ethan lay unconscious on a nearby mattress, his small chest rising and falling steadily. Yet Sarah could still feel the weight of the malevolent presence that lingered around him. "This is it," Laura whispered. "If we do this, there will be no going back. We will sever the bloodline completely, and the spirit will be destroyed. But it will come at a cost." Sarah didn't hesitate. "I'm ready." With a single breath, the ritual began. The candles flickered, the wind howled through the windows, and the temperature dropped. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, swirling as if alive. A chill ran down Sarah's spine, but she forced herself to stay focused. As the ritual continued, Ethan stirred. His eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, Sarah saw her son. Just her son. But that was short-lived. Ethan's body tensed, his eyes turning black as the spirit fought back, trying to reclaim control. "No," Sarah cried, but her voice was lost in the chaos of the ritual. The air vibrated with a power she couldn't comprehend. The spirit's voice boomed in her mind, cold and relentless. "You cannot break what is already written. The bloodline is mine." But Sarah's resolve only strengthened. She pushed forward, chanting the words with all the strength she had left, knowing that this was the only way to save Ethan and end the curse for good. As the ritual reached its peak, Sarah felt a sharp pain in her chest. The connection between her and the spirit deepened, pulling her into a vision of the past, of the ancestor who had cursed their family so many years ago. His dark eyes stared into hers, his voice echoing in her mind. "You think you can destroy me? I am your heritage, your destiny." But then, in the midst of the vision, Sarah felt something shift. She realized what had to be done. The bloodline needed to be severed, not just by destroying the coffin or performing rituals, but by breaking the cycle altogether. She looked down at Ethan, who was still struggling, and made the ultimate choice. In a final act of desperation, Sarah reached into her own heart and broke the bond. The power surged through her, and she collapsed to the floor, her body trembling with the weight of the sacrifice. For a moment, everything stopped. The air grew still, and the oppressive weight lifted. Sarah felt herself slipping into unconsciousness, but before she succumbed, she saw Ethan's face change. The darkness in his eyes receded, and for the first time in weeks, he looked like her son again. As Sarah lost consciousness, she felt a sense of peace. The curse was broken. The bloodline was free. When Sarah awoke, she found herself in her own bed. The room was bathed in soft light, and for the first time in ages, the air felt normal. Ethan was sitting beside her, his face illuminated by the morning sun. He smiled at her, his eyes warm and full of life. "Mama, you're awake," he said, his voice soft and innocent. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she hugged him tightly. The curse was gone. The family line had been freed. But as she held her son, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Had they truly destroyed the spirit? Or had something darker been left behind? The weeks that followed felt like a dream. Ethan was healthy and happy, and Sarah had begun to rebuild her life. They moved away from the old house to a new town where they could start fresh. But every so often, Sarah would catch a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye, something that didn't belong. She told herself it was nothing, just the remnants of an old, terrifying chapter in their lives. But deep down, she knew, some curses, no matter how much you try to sever them, never truly disappear. Even in their new home, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't truly free. At night, she would wake in a cold sweat, her heart racing, haunted by fleeting visions of shadows and whispers. She kept telling herself it was just the trauma of the past, but there were moments when she thought she saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway or heard soft footsteps when no one else was there. "Ethan," she whispered one night as they sat together, watching TV. "Do you ever get scared?" Ethan looked up at her, his eyes wide and innocent. "Scared of what, Mom?" Sarah forced a smile, but deep down, she knew the spirit was still out there. It had only been weakened. It had not been eradicated. One afternoon, months after moving, Sarah felt a sudden cold breeze wash over her as she was standing in the kitchen. The house had grown eerily quiet, the kind of silence that preceded something unnatural. A chill ran down her spine as she turned toward the door leading to the basement. "Ethan, stay here," she said, her voice trembling. When she descended into the basement, the familiar scent of decay hit her immediately. The air felt heavier, like it was holding something waiting. As she explored, Sarah's heart sank as she spotted an old, tattered box pushed against the far wall, covered in dust and cobwebs. The box, it had been her family's last attempt to contain the curse, a forgotten relic from the past. And now, it was here. Upon opening the box, Sarah's hands trembled as she uncovered a pile of ancient documents. Among them was a letter that sent a shock through her core. "You thought you could destroy me, but I am not bound by time. I am bound by blood, your blood. The curse cannot be broken, only passed on." Her breath caught in her throat. The spirit hadn't just been bound to the coffin. It was tied to her entire lineage. It had been passed from generation to generation, and the ritual she had performed had only delayed its power. This was far from over. The more Sarah read, the more she understood. This was not a curse. It was a pact made centuries ago with an ancient entity that had granted power and wealth to her ancestors in exchange for their bloodline. The coffin had been the vessel that housed its power, but the true nature of the curse ran deeper than she had ever realized. The entity's influence stretched through every branch of her family tree. It wasn't just about breaking the curse. It was about finding a way to free her bloodline from the ancient pact that had bound it. One night, as Sarah sat with Laura in the living room, a knock on the door interrupted their conversation. It was unexpected, especially at this hour. When Sarah opened the door, a tall figure stood in the doorway, draped in dark clothing, his face obscured by a hood. "I've been searching for you," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "I need your help." Laura's eyes widened in recognition. "You're from the Order," she whispered. The man nodded. "The entity you fought, it's not gone, and it's looking for someone. Someone it believes is the key to finishing what it started. Your son, Ethan." It turned out the man was from an ancient order that had been tracking the entity for centuries. They had kept an eye on Sarah's family line for generations, knowing that eventually the curse would resurface. The order had once tried to contain the entity, but their efforts had failed, just as Sarah's had. "It's not enough to sever the bloodline," the man explained. "The spirit feeds on more than just blood. It feeds on fear, on chaos. It needs a vessel to finally achieve its full form, and it believes that Ethan is the one who will carry out its will." Fear gripped Sarah's heart. Ethan was just a child. How could he be the key to something so terrible? The Order's leader, a man named Brother Matthias, explained that the entity had been seeking Ethan since before he was born. His lineage made him the perfect candidate for the spirit's ultimate plan. The ritual had not severed the connection. It had only weakened it, and now the spirit was trying to reclaim what it had lost. Sarah realized that she had to act quickly. The longer they waited, the closer the entity came to fully possessing Ethan. But to defeat the spirit once and for all, she would need to travel to the source, the place where the pact had first been made. Brother Matthias handed her an ancient map marked with a dark, cursed location. It was in the heart of the forest, miles away from the town. "You must go there," he urged. "It's the only way to stop the entity." With Ethan by her side and Laura and Brother Matthias guiding them, Sarah journeyed into the forest. The trees were thick, and the air grew colder the deeper they ventured. It felt as if they were entering another world, a place where time and reality seemed to bend. As they reached the center of the forest, Sarah saw the remnants of an ancient temple. It had been hidden for centuries, long forgotten by the modern world. But the temple had never forgotten her family. It was here that the pact had been made. The stone doors creaked open as they approached, revealing a dark, sacred space filled with symbols and ancient carvings. Inside the temple, the air was thick with the energy of the curse. The walls pulsed with dark power, and a low, ominous hum filled the space. At the altar stood a figure, a man, or what used to be a man, his face twisted and skeletal, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was the spirit's true form, waiting for its final moment of triumph. "I have waited centuries," the entity hissed, "and now you will give me what I need, Sarah. Your blood, your son." Ethan stood frozen beside Sarah, his eyes wide with fear. The spirit's power was overwhelming, but Sarah would not allow it to take him. Sarah knew that in order to break the curse once and for all, she would have to destroy the source, the altar where the pact had been sealed. But doing so would mean sacrificing herself, ending the bloodline for good. "I won't let you have him," Sarah shouted, stepping forward. Brother Matthias and Laura stepped into the circle, helping her perform the final ritual, one that would undo the pact and destroy the spirit. But as they chanted the ancient words, the temple shook violently, and the entity roared in fury. "You cannot undo what was written," the entity cried, its form shifting and flickering like smoke. The power of the ritual reached its peak, and as Sarah poured every ounce of strength into it, she felt the life force draining from her. But she didn't stop. The love she had for Ethan gave her the strength to push forward, and in one final desperate act, she shattered the altar. The temple collapsed around them, and the darkness dissipated. The entity screamed in agony as it was torn apart, its influence vanishing into the ether. When the dust settled, the sun was rising. The forest was quiet, peaceful for the first time in centuries. Ethan looked up at Sarah, his eyes clear and free from the shadow that had haunted him. "Mom?" he whispered, his voice shaky but full of relief. Sarah hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "It's over, baby. It's over." As they left the temple, Sarah realized that she had done what no one before her had been able to do. The entity was gone. The bloodline was free. There would be no more hauntings, no more curses. They were finally free to live their lives in peace. But Sarah also understood that this had come at a great cost. The power of the curse had been severed, but she had to leave behind her past, her family legacy. She could never return to her old life. The cycle was broken, and so was everything she had once known. Back home, Sarah and Ethan began anew. They lived quietly, far away from the horrors of their past. Sarah never spoke of the curse again, and Ethan grew up happy and healthy, free from the darkness that had once threatened to consume him. Years passed, but sometimes, on quiet nights, Sarah would hear the wind whispering, just faintly, as though the forest still held memories of the past. She never spoke of it, but there was always that lingering feeling. Ethan, now a young man, began to ask questions about his past. He had always felt the weight of something unknown, an unseen force following him. Sarah could see the spark of curiosity in his eyes, and as much as she wanted to protect him from the truth, she knew she could never hide it. One fateful night, as Ethan explored the old house, he stumbled upon a hidden room, a room that Sarah had never seen before. Inside was a journal, filled with cryptic messages. The curse had not truly been destroyed, and in this journal, Ethan found the final piece of the puzzle. Ethan realized that the spirit, though defeated, was not truly gone. It had passed on its legacy to him, and now it was up to him to protect his bloodline from the curse that would inevitably return. With the final piece in place, Ethan made a vow to